Good afternoon and welcome to People Power Social Club, our daily digital event space where we get together, we learn something new, and we just check on each other during this COVID-19 lockdown. Today we have green researcher Dr. Josh Bailey talking on hydrogen and whether it's usable as a heating source. Josh, over to you, please.
Thanks, Milky, and thank you everyone for coming. My name is Josh Bailey. I'm a researcher at the Electrochemical Innovation Lab at University College London. I did my PhD in hydrogen fuel cells, specifically a high temperature variant called a solid oxide fuel cell. But that was some years ago now. I've been now a postdoctoral researcher for a couple of years. I moved on to look at membranes, so in fuel cells, but also for separation of CO2. And now I'm focusing more on next generation batteries. So hydrogen for heating, the title of my talk is hydrogen heating possible? I hope to sort of dive into this and give you some things to think about, but it's certainly not my expertise. It's more of an interest of mine, and it's something which I think is getting a lot of traction at the moment. So with that, I'm just going to make sure that I keep to time. So I'll start the time, and I'll give a bit of context. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here a bit, but I'm sure most, if not all of you, know that in 2008, the UK laid down the UK Climate Change Act and promised to bring down greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 relative to 1990. And then last year, they upped their game and became more ambitious and said, actually, we're going to go for net zero emissions by 2050. So if you look at the plot on the right-hand side, and the x-axis, you have time. On the y-axis, you have your emissions in millions of tons of CO2 equivalent. And if you look at those red lines, these are legislated limits. These are what they said along the way to that 2050 mark that they would be achieving. And you see the little blue and green. Well, blue is emissions excluding. I don't know why, but there's a lot of controversy over this, international aviation and shipping. But if you take actual emissions, which includes those, but not necessarily everything, you can see that maybe we didn't meet that first target quite. In the second case, it was met, and increasingly, we seem to be doing a reasonably good job, but we've got a long way to go. You can see that pathway that's drawn out there, minus 3.3% per year that we have to get down to 2050. So there's good progress that's been made, and a lot of time has been looked at electricity and how we, and even transport. But what I want to point out is that actually in the UK, heating, and in particular domestic heating, is responsible for over a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're going to make changes to get to a point of net zero emissions by 2050, we really need to be thinking about heating as well as electricity and transport. So just a little bit more context. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, unless you live in Northern Ireland, I think most places in the UK primarily run their domestic heating, cooking, etc. on natural gas. It's changing in Northern Ireland. I think there's quite a lot of oil still at the moment. But as you'll see on the left-hand side, we've got from the government's own reports, it says that the predominant source of heating for the vast majority of customers connected to the grid is natural gas. There's some biomethane, but not in large quantities. And you'll see on the figure on the top right that we've got sort of the big six. Although British Gas seems to be losing its market share and a lot more small suppliers are coming out, which bodes well for some of the future changes. And I guess to fully give you the context, 75% of the UK's current heating demand in buildings is met by natural gas. So if we're going to tackle decarbonisation, then we need to be looking at natural gas. So if we want to move forward, what can we do? So what are the potential solutions? How could we be heating our homes in a more carbon neutral or a more green way? One way you could think about it is we could, like we have with transport, we could think about electric heating. I mean, it's not really thought of engineering-wise as the best solution for heating. It's a great way of powering devices, of doing lighting, but when it comes to heating and cooling, it has its issues in terms of efficiencies. There's a lot of great work out there looking at air and ground source heat pumps. These have been around for a long time, but they're becoming more efficient. But it really does depend on capital costs and the ability to be able to install these in the buildings in question, but there's certainly work to be done there. Another area which I'll touch on is the increase in the use of biomethane. So rather than using natural gas deposits, why don't we get our methane from a biomass source, in which case you've taken in the CO2 in the growth of that biomass, and it's not zero carbon on net, but it is a massive reduction. And then the one I want to actually focus on today is reintroducing hydrogen. Now, I want to give you a bit of context. Why do I say reintroduce hydrogen? Well, a bit of history. Actually, although we're all probably used to natural gas, it wasn't always around in the UK as our fuel of use for example, street lighting or even domestic lighting. In fact, the use of hydrogen as an energy source goes back to the end of the 18th century. An engineer, William Murdoch, lit his house and office in Cornwall using something called town gas. So over the next century, over the 19th century, gasworks and gas distribution pipelines were built across the UK to ship town gas all the way around the country. So up until the 1960s, this town gas, also known as coal gas, comes from coal, contained about 50% hydrogen, about 35% methane, about 10% carbon monoxide, and about 5% ethylene or ethene. And that was common as the gas for fuel and lighting. So it's made from heating coal in the absence of oxygen, but it was replaced by natural gas only really, during the 20th century. And a lot of this was to do with the 1960s, us discovering these indigenous natural gas fields, and a few other reasons. But essentially, we did for over a century use gas for heating and as a fuel generally, that contained large quantities of hydrogen. So that's why I talk about the reintroduction of hydrogen. So how would we go about this? What do we need to think about if we were to move towards a hydrogen-based heating network? So firstly, what needs to change? One thing I need to point out is that there is existing UK legislation that prevents hydrogen accounting for more than 0.1% of national grid mix at any time. So this is because this is not a limit of like how much you put in because you want to use it, but how much is in there almost as an impurity. So there's definitely room for policy change, and a lot of work needs to be done to figure out what is the sensible amount of hydrogen to put in from a safety perspective, from an economic perspective, from a technological perspective. But fortunately, even though this legislation exists, there are trials, which I'll get onto in a moment, that have been able to sort of bypass these rules just in the short term. The other thing we need to think about is infrastructure. So importantly, and one of the big reasons why people are pushing hydrogen as opposed to, let's say, electrification or a different solution to our heating problem, is that the idea is to leverage the current UK gas network. So we don't have to completely change the infrastructure. But what we do need to do is make them fit for purpose. So we do need to introduce this green gas, whether that's biomethane or hydrogen, and ensure that it's safely developed and maintained using the correct piping, which I can maybe go into a little bit of detail about, but it's not my forte. But it's certainly important to think about whether it's the transmission or the distribution or the pipelines right next to your house, what exactly they're made from. Fortunately, over the last 17 years, the UK has already been refitting a lot of its old piping with new plastic piping. And a lot of research is showing that actually, even though hydrogen does escape more easily than methane, a lot of the new piping and even some of the metal piping before is still it's not affected by this problem of embrittlement necessarily if it's not at high pressure. And a lot of the escape actually turns out not to be at joints, but actually through the tubing itself, and to a quantity which is greater than methane, but actually been shown not to necessarily be of any economic or safety concern. So there's a lot of research going into exactly how much is lost where and how it can be safely mitigated. And finally, there needs to also be some movement on the end use. So there is, for example, in the hydrogen area, there's always these lovely using high for some reason. It just seems to be cool. So you'll see this comes up quite a bit. High for heat is a £25 million UK government program that's looking at how hydrogen is used, not in the transmission and distribution pipelines, but more by the end user downstream of the meter. So looking at appliances and buildings and seeing how it affects us all. So I would say broadly, those are the three areas that really need to change. And what I'd like to do is just highlight some projects in this field, because in 15 minutes it's probably quite hard to get through everything, but this might be something if people are interested in, they can look into it more. So one of the first big moves forward in this area was about 4 years ago. There was a project called H21, an ongoing project, but in 2016 there was a report that came out that it focused on Leeds City, and it was led by the Northern Gas Networks, but it was also other gas networks around the UK were involved. And the important take home is that it proved that you can convert the existing gas grid, in this case to carry 100% hydrogen, although this is not necessarily the way that all gas networks will go. And they proved that it was technically possible and that it was cost effective. And so a lot of work has come out of that, and a lot of the projects I'll show you have really kind of used this as a stepping stone, as a springboard to a lot of the policy and further safety tests that are going to be carried out. So H21 proved that for a specific network. And then they are concentrating now on two pieces of work. One of them is actually doing quite a sophisticated safety assessment. And I can allude to, or I can show you a video maybe at the end, or at least point you in the direction of the video, depending on time, where they sort of build houses and gas distribution networks and all sorts of different aspects along the pipeline to sort of test the safety and show that it can be as safe as our natural gas network today. And they're also working specifically looking at a project to turn the gas networks up in the north of England to convert them into hydrogen. What would be needed, design requirements of the infrastructure that would be needed to do that. So that was kind of like the underpinning work, but there's some more specific work behind this. Another general policy move was by the Energy Networks Association. So this is something called Gas Goes Green, and it convened these different networks. So Cadent is another gas network, Northern Gas Networks, and the National Grid to work on this project. And actually, during this work, they highlighted that both hydrogen and biomethane are required to accelerate progress. So it's one of those examples of getting a big consortium together and actually figuring out how we can get to this net zero carbon, and it's highlighted that hydrogen and biomethane are really important to get there. And as a result of this and H21, there's a lot of work looking at how we can move towards that. So we need to sort of starting now looking at preparing for the transition. So doing a lot of the initial work on safety and policy, and connecting the different people and players involved, as well as the gas networks themselves, and then introducing, whether it's anaerobic digestion for biomethane or new hydrogen production facilities, and then expanding the demand base. And at the same time, you'll see also generally improving energy efficiency, so reducing our overall gas consumption and replacing natural gas bit by bit with hydrogen and biomethane. So this is the Gas Goes Green plan that you can find out much more detail about at the link below. But some other projects that I think highlight what's been happening very recently in this area. Again, as I say, we've got High Deploy here. They love this this way of talking about their projects. So High Deploy was a project that started towards the end of last year, and it is a pilot project up in Stoke, looking at Keele University. So the idea is to inject hydrogen into their existing natural gas network, much like the H21 project in Leeds. And here the gas network supplies 30 faculty buildings and 100 domestic properties. So this is actually the first ever live demonstration of hydrogen going into homes. And as I alluded to before, it's not always about putting 100% in. Here, it's blending up to 20% by volume of hydrogen into the natural gas grid, and showing that it is a safer and green alternative to gas that we use now. And the researchers say that actually, if we do follow this and we scale it up, we could mitigate the annual emission of about 6 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. So it's a huge project that has got underway. I think with all the coronavirus issues going on now, it's somewhat been halted, but I think it does give an example of just where we are, that there's actually live projects of inputting small amounts or appreciable amounts of hydrogen into these networks, and progress is definitely being made. Another example of a project, this is from the Cadent website. So this is HyNet. So this is in Liverpool, Manchester area, but also working with industry. And it actually involves a larger scale project. So this is heating 2 million homes in the area. Here, it really combines what I've been talking about in terms of distributing this gas in the system with where the hydrogen is produced. So as I mentioned in a previous talk in this series, hydrogen production is a very key thing to think about going forward is move away from brown hydrogen and much closer to blue and green hydrogen, which basically means that we need to decarbonize it. We can't be just doing steam methane reforming and allowing the CO2 out to the atmosphere. So in the HyNet project, the idea is to produce your hydrogen through steam methane reforming, but to combine that with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So here, you convert your natural gas to clean burning hydrogen, and the CO2 that you capture from this is then stored offshore in gas reservoirs. So here's another example of a recent project which is pushing very fast in the direction of decarbonizing our gas network. So really, that's just what I wanted to highlight today. I'm coming up to my time. I just wanted to place a few different logos on here. So if anyone wants to find out more about this, you've got all your gas net, or most of the gas networks in the UK on here. It's the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy that sort of tackles this on a government level. There's a lot of work by Cadent in particular, and Worcester and Bosch on the industrial side. And the Northwest Hydrogen Alliance have a lot of things online that you can read up more about what's happening. So to summarize, is hydrogen heating possible? I hope I've shown you that yes, we have good evidence that it is possible, both technically and economically. But it does require rigorous safety testing and some infrastructure upgrades. But nevertheless, a lot of this work is already underway. There's funding that's being provided. There's another bit of funding that's come to the H21 project, I think about £7 million very recently. On top of that, £25 million for the High Heat project. And there's a huge consortium. This isn't a project that's just been run by one provider or one think tank or industry, one company. It's actually a huge consortium, and it's actually developing the idea on many fronts, from the technical, the economic, the safety, and even the public perception. So that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take questions. I'll answer them as best I can. But if you want to, I would really recommend watching this 10-minute video on the H21 website, which really talks about the safety elements that they are looking at. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Josh. That's a really interesting insight into all the different flavors of hydrogen heating and a good overview of whether it is possible. And it seems like it is, so thank you. We have time for some questions, and we've got some participants in the room. So if anybody would like to raise up a hand and ask a question, otherwise I will ask a question. Yes, Claire.
Hi, I've got a question. Not quite old enough to remember town gas, but I know in the 1960s when they converted over from town gas to natural gas, it basically involved end users changing or adjusting their equipment because there's a difference in the amount of oxygen needed to burn the two fuels. And I'm assuming that the same would be true of hydrogen. Obviously, the stoichiometrics, or whatever you call it, are very different for burning methane and burning hydrogen. The volume of oxygen required to burn it efficiently and safely is going to be different from burning natural gas. So would that present a big issue? Because unlike the 1960s, when most people heated using coal or oil, everybody's also got central heating. And if everybody needed to convert their central heating boiler as well as their cooker in order to burn hydrogen, wouldn't that present a bit of an issue? Because you know, you can't just do that overnight. You know,
yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really good question.
It's very difficult to transform the grid. You know, surely the grid would have to be either methane or hydrogen. It'd have to be like, you know, as from this date, it's going to be hydrogen, and you have to be ready. So, is there an issue there?
So it's a really good question, and it touches on a few different points. The first thing to talk about is this idea of whether it needs to be one or the other. And the truth is, it doesn't need to change from pure methane to pure hydrogen. At the moment, there's methane from gas fields, and there's a small amount of biomethane, and even including that requires some changes to the way that the pipelines are maintained. But the idea at the moment in the US and in the UK is to introduce small amounts of hydrogen. And yes, it does change the mix. And a lot of work is going into working out what they can do at the sort of network level. Now, in terms of appliances, the reports that I've seen talk about a phased introduction of new end-use appliances, and that's the same case as you mentioned when you changed from town gas to natural gas. It wasn't done overnight. It was a phased change, and that there has to be a balance between policy, what is helped by the government that's moving towards this target. How does it subsidize it? What mechanisms does it put in place? End user uptake, it has to be a case of public perception, so people feel comfortable using hydrogen. But no, I don't think that there's any players in this that are thinking that it would be an overnight change or that it would be easy. But it certainly would be a phased change. It wouldn't require all hydrogen. And actually, some initial work is showing that hydrogen in these environments isn't posing as many problems as maybe were foreseen. So I don't have the ins and outs of a perfect answer, but I certainly would say that it's not an immediate cliff edge change. It would have to be phased, and it would have to be subsidized, or at least there must be a government mechanism, some policy to help it.
So you're saying it's almost a bit like bioethanol, that you can burn maybe a 20% mixture in existing equipment, and that wouldn't be a problem, and then you could maybe gradually increase the ratio of hydrogen and do it in a bit of a phased way like that?
It's a similar example. I mean, whenever you have these mixtures, there's changes, but they're more subtle than if you were to change, wholesale. I know that there are different levels of hydrogen that are allowed in different networks around Europe. For example, in Germany, I think they have a higher tolerance for that hydrogen. So there is cases in different places, actually. I mean, there's still places like, I think, Hong Kong that uses town gas. I think there's a place in, maybe it's Honolulu. So there are usually test cases around for us to work out what's happening in these different blends. But yeah, it's a massive operation. That's why I think it's positive that you've got a huge number of players that are involved that are doing a lot of this groundwork with this long-term plan. They're doing this sort of 5 to 10 year plan before they're really sort of putting a lot of these things in place. I mean, and that there's work before that too. But I really recommend watching that video, because it kind of goes through some of the different things they're doing in terms of testing on the transmission. And also I can send you information about some of the academic work in the US looking exactly this. So how much hydrogen can we introduce? Where does it leak? Is that leak actually an economic or a technological difficulty, or is it something we can kind of accept or mitigate easily?
Yeah, because obviously hydrogen itself isn't a greenhouse gas either. So leaks of hydrogen are potentially not actually anything like as much of a problem as leaks of methane.
Yeah, in fact, there's some really
environmental point of view. Obviously, you have to be safety conscious. You can't expose small amounts of hydrogen in the atmosphere. Really isn't a problem. It just drifts off, doesn't it?
Exactly. So as long as it doesn't end up above the lower exposure limit in a confined space, it's highly diffusive. It kind of expands out or it flies off very, very quickly. And yeah, some of the literature that I've been reading has been showing that actually by putting more hydrogen in, hydrogen escapes more than the methane. Actually, you get less of the methane loss. So as long as you keep it below economic and safety issues, in the sense of what you're talking about on large scale, how much methane actually gets out into the atmosphere, it is a net positive in terms of greenhouse gases.
I just think it's really exciting. So thank you so much for your talk. It's really exciting.
Tim?
Hi, Josh, that's a very interesting presentation. Thanks very much for that. I guess it's sort of a little bit similar to Claire's point. If you start, dosing the natural gas mix with hydrogen, presumably you affect its calorific value, and everybody's gas meter needs to be changed, otherwise they'll be charged. And it's that sort of issue that I mean, it's a bit like boiling a frog very slowly. If it happens very gently, nobody will notice. But when you wake up, suddenly find out you're paying twice the price, or I don't know, maybe it's better value. I don't know.
So it's a really good question. So again, in my reading, there's a lot of evidence to show that that's exactly true, that the meters would have to be changed. So no one is working on this project thinking that this would be a quick fix. But certainly there's a lot of work that's looking at all of these different aspects, whether it's on the transmission and distribution networks, but down to public perception. Do people feel comfortable with this in their home? Do they feel comfortable with the idea of burning hydrogen? How does it affect the appliances? How does it affect the meters? But I totally agree that it can't be something that is done immediately. But if we look at the alternatives, I mean, if we're going to get to net zero, you need to look at heating, and you need to look at natural gas. And I guess different players are thinking a little bit more about biomethane versus hydrogen. There's a sort of some people want more of one or more of the other. But I definitely see hydrogen as being part of that mix, particularly as we move towards creating more blue and green hydrogen. To me, it makes sense to have an increased amount of something which, at the end use, when you burn it, you don't produce CO2. But it's not a quick fix. It's not something that will solve all problems immediately. But I think it's encouraging that this work is getting traction, and I think there's more and more players that are involved that are saying, okay, we can do this safely and we can do it cost effectively as well.
Thanks.
Thank you. Eduardo.
Hey, Josh. Thanks a lot for the talk. It was really, really interesting. I just have a question on something you touched barely on the problems of electrifying the heating and the cooking. I'll give a simple example, not the most academic thing, but in our building, it's all electric, I think because the insurance is cheaper to just not have gas at all. So our boiler, our cooking, our heating is all electric. And I was wondering, what are the challenges to have that countrywide?
That's an interesting question. I think when you look at the efficiencies that are involved when you're forming heat from electricity, I mean, you've probably produced your electricity from heat in the first place, and then you're sort of taking it back. Yeah. I think, as far as I know, I haven't looked into the macroeconomics and the technical side of it that much on this scale. But I think that, generally speaking, if you want to do heating more efficiently, gas and this space heating is much better accomplished on efficiency levels from burning gas than it is from probably burning gas in the first place to make electricity, and then electricity to then give you back the heat.
But hydrogen from electrolysis.
So this is very interesting. So where do you get your hydrogen from? So a lot of the work at the moment is actually not necessarily focusing on electrolyzed hydrogen. It's actually focused on steam methane reformed hydrogen, but with carbon capture. So then you have the problem with the carbon capture technology, which is there and just actually needs a bit more funding. The technology is there, and if you have the use case, I think carbon capture for a large-scale system, which allows you then to pump that hydrogen into a network that already exists, becomes more cost competitive and actually becomes a kind of not best case scenario, but if you've got these reservoirs where you can store the CO2, or you start using the CO2 for other applications, you start actually providing a means to decarbonize. That it may not even be the end result. It may be a transition. But I think that there are some really good models where if you have a centralized facility which is using your natural gas, but to make hydrogen, which is then burned without the CO2, and the CO2 is essentially stored in these reservoirs close to, often these are sort of, I think it's like Teesside plants, and close to places that you can store the CO2. I think it kind of is likely to be an element of how we decarbonize our network. But the exact playoff between, I mean, electrification is a big thing in the way we produce our utility electricity, or even for our transport, moving towards battery electric vehicles or even fuel cell electric vehicles. The playoff I would have to do more research on. But I just know from my reading that, yeah, generally speaking, for heating, this seems to be the way that people are thinking about doing it.
Josh, do you have time for any more questions? I know often at 1 o'clock you need to get off.
I can take one or two more if there are any.
Hector,
as Alex. I say, it's not really my field, so I may have already got to the end of my knowledge on this. Go ahead.
I think we'll take Hector, please.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I was just sort of touching on something you briefly mentioned upon, which is why anyone would bother trying to focus on converting to biomethane when your end product of combustion is carbon dioxide. Doesn't seem like a sensible. And then also there's the issue of where you get your biofuel or your biological matter for. So it doesn't really seem like a sensible
I think it comes back to questions by Claire and Tim, in that if you are replacing like for like molecules, and you're dealing with burning methane, rather than changing the mix, then you actually overcome, or at least minimize to some degree, the issues of both distribution and transmission and your end use appliances. So you can kind of see it as essentially taking a bit more CO2 for all of the methane that you're using, because you're getting it from a natural source. But then you mentioned another problem generally with biomass, and I know that in the UK the Climate Committee is now pointing the UK a bit further away from biomass, because a lot of it is imported. We don't actually have that much of a supply here for the amount that we're kind of upscaling to do. So yeah, there's certainly an issue over where you get it from, but I can kind of see some advantages of at least maybe having some as an interim before you get your hydrogen scaled up, because it does, after all, decarbonize that network. I mean, we've got to move pretty fast. We've got 30 years to completely get to net zero. And at the moment, as you see, we've got 75%, what was that? So 75% of the homes, buildings heating from natural gas. If you supply some of that from the same molecule, but it's, you know, the CO2 has been taken in to produce it on our life scale, then maybe it's still a sort of interim solution. But yeah, I'm obviously a hydrogen advocate, but I can see why does that make sense? That there might be some positives too, just because you don't have to it's not changing your mix as much.
Yeah, good.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. Can we give Josh a round of applause for his talk on hydrogen heating and its possibilities today? Thank you.
Stay safe, stay busy, and tell us a cool story next time we see you.